अस्सलाम वालेकुम व्यूअर्स, इसरार कसाना हियर जी। एक तो मैं शुरू में आपको बताऊं कि अभी हम प्रोग्राम एक करने लगे हैं जो बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट प्रोग्राम है, और ये मेरा ख्याल है कि इस तरह का प्रोग्राम शायद ही आपने सोशल मीडिया पे देखा होगा। क्योंकि हम लोग जनरली अपने एनालिसिस तो आपके साथ शेयर करते रहते हैं, लेकिन जो जो लोग फ्रीकैन होते हैं उनके साथ बात करना जो होता है वो ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट हुआ करता है। और आज मेरी बड़ी खुशनसीबी है कि मेरे साथ एक ऐसे दोस्त मौजूद होंगे जो कि पैलेस्टीनियन है, जो गजा से हैं, और उनका बैकग्राउंड उनके साथ शेयर करते हुए आपके साथ बातें करेंगे हम लोग। लेकिन इट विल बी इन इंग्लिश, और उसमें हम बात करेंगे मुख्तलिफ इशूज के हवाले से। तो इसलिए आप थोड़ा सा बेयर विद मी, और हम आज बात करेंगे फ़लस्तीनी इशू के ऊपर, और ख़ास तौर पे इस हवाले से कि वहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है। और मुझे ज्वाइन कर रहे हैं ब्रदर रमजी बारूद। Ramzi Barood is a wonderful person. I know him indirectly. He's been all over actually. So I think I must tell you, my viewers, that Mr. Ramzi is a wonderful person. He's an editor of the Palestine Chronicle. His latest book is My Father Was a Freedom Fighter: Gaza's Untold Story. So, Brother Ramzi, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you very much, Ramzi. First of all, can you give us the 360 view of the whole situation right now? As of today, what is the latest situation in Gaza?
Well, the latest situation in Gaza is that a ceasefire was declared from Israel's side, and that's also indicative of some major change happening to the nature of this so-called conflict between the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation on the one hand, and the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian people on the other. Of course, ceasefire doesn't mean that we are returning to any degree of normalcy as far as Palestinians are concerned, because Gaza is still under a hermetic Israeli siege. And because the West Bank remains an occupied territory, illegally occupied by Israel in 1967, and because East Jerusalem is still illegally annexed by Israel as of 1981, and also because of the entirety of historic Palestine and the Palestinians living there are still denied their very most basic rights, whether politically or right of movement or right to practice their democratic rights as people who can vote and select representatives and so forth and so on. So the situation really hasn't changed in any way fundamentally for people, for Palestinians on the ground.
Right.
What has changed is that Israeli bombs are no longer falling on Gaza as we speak.
So that's at least a good news. But we've seen 11 days of shock and awe, using the American jargon, horror, gory pictures. Children being killed, women wailing over the dead bodies, indiscriminate bombing, deliberate dehumanization of Palestinian people. But as you said, finally we have the ceasefire. But in this 11 days of campaign, which they launched against the Palestinians, who won and who lost? Both are celebrating. And especially, should we think in these terms, that who won and lost?
Right. Unfortunately, if we must use these terminologies, we have to think in terms of the context in which terminology of this nature is being used. The Palestinians do not have an army in the traditional sense.
Right.
Therefore, we cannot really judge winning and losing in terms of, what sort of territorial objectives did the Palestinians achieve. They haven't liberated an inch of Palestine. So
Right.
why is it that Palestinians are celebrating? Are Palestinians being delusional collectively? Are they desperately searching for a symbolic victory to say that finally we are turning the table? I am one of those who've argued that Palestinians have won. But again, I am making that argument within a specific context. We are not dealing with a traditional war. We are dealing with a liberation movement. The Palestinians are fighting a liberation war, not any different from any of the liberation wars that have been fought in the Southern Hemisphere against British, French, Dutch, and other forms of colonialism that have existed in that part of the world in the 19th century and up to the 70s and even 80s of the 20th century. When you are fighting this kind of war, what you are trying to do here is to prove that the people, the victims, the colonized are not relenting. They are still resisting, and they are still raising the price for the colonizer so that the colonizer cannot carry on with business as usual. What Israel wants to do, Israel's primary objective is to normalize its military occupation and apartheid in Palestine. It wants to play by the rules that only Israel creates, where the Palestinians are always at the receiving end of Israeli harm and Israeli whatever damage Israel inflicts on them. Palestinians have won because this is the first time in their history that they were actually able to push back the Israeli military machine and to raise a new equation, an entirely new equation, in which Palestinians say to Israel, if we do not have real peace, you will not have peace. If we do not have real justice, you will never have tranquility and harmony in your own society. If our people are going to be treated and dehumanized, mistreated and dehumanized in such a way, then your people too are going to suffer the consequences. So there is some sort of a balance, and I know some people would argue, but what can the balance of Palestinian homemade rockets create as far as Israel's F-35 and F-36 is concerned?
Absolutely.
That's ludicrous from military terms.
Yeah.
Yes, but this is not about a comparison between dead and wounded. Because
but when we see the Israeli side, even the Israeli politicians are slamming Netanyahu for Gaza's failures and ceasefire conditions. So can you demystify that too?
Well, absolutely. Well, this is precisely why Israel did not want to have an agreed upon ceasefire with the resistance. And they decided to opt for a ceasefire with no agreement, even though it made them appear to be the ones retreating first. But the reason they did so is they feared that an agreement with the resistance, number one, will validate the resistance in Gaza as an actual movement with demands. And that is going to be a large concession on the part of Israel. Number two, because they want to keep all the issues in Palestine delinked. The racism and apartheid in Israel, the violence and occupation in the West Bank, and of course, most importantly, the ethnic cleansing that's happening in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. They did not want Palestinians to feel united in terms of their demands. So they opted for what is being understood to be an Israeli defeat, which is reaching a ceasefire or declaring ceasefire without a prior agreement.
So, looking at the situation, Ramzi, is there anything to worry about, especially regarding the dreams lost during this 11 days of indiscriminate bombing?
Of course, I mean, we can't, it's one thing to talk about a Palestinian victory, whether real or symbolic, and a whole different thing to actually think about the nearly 300 people who were killed, the nearly 2,000 people who were injured, and the many people who will never be able to walk again or to live a normal life. And of course, the 17,000 homes that were either completely destroyed or largely damaged by all of this. Yes, so many hopes and dreams were killed and destroyed in this Israeli attack. But on the other hand, this is, I am afraid, the nature of the liberation struggle. If you are fighting for freedom, freedom is way too precious not to expect that there will be some serious sacrifices. The Palestinian people have sacrificed for over 70 years now. Generation after generation, they put forward some of their finest women and men. They have lost so many children. They have lost so much of their freedom, and in order for them to fight for something that they perceive to be everybody should perceive to be very precious, and that is freedom. So sadly, there will be more sacrifices, but the hope is that Palestinians are now finally on the right track, because now they are thinking collectively. The disunity that we have seen between
Palestinians, and we saw this unity. Yes, you're right. We saw the unity in this conflict right now.
And I and many other intellectuals made that argument in the past, that you cannot reduce this reductionist mentality that when we think of unity, we think Hamas, Fatah, the Palestinian factions. That's not the unity we have been fighting for. The unity is the unity of narrative, the unity of Palestinian discourse, where a Palestinian in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, or a Palestinian in Gaza, or even a Palestinian in the Arab communities living in today's Israel, see themselves as one, fighting for one cause, fighting as one people, fighting for one objective, and fighting as one. And that's what we perceive to be the real unity of Palestine.
And I think so far as the narrative is concerned, I think you should take a control of the narrative of Palestinians, and the narrative, I think, should be the resilience and the resistance. I think you should take pride in it, and you should take control of the whole narrative.
Absolutely. This is something that we, a term that we have coined, which is reclaiming our narrative, reclaiming the narrative, not just from mainstream prejudices and biases, and reclaiming the narrative that has been allocated to Israel. Israel and Israel alone tells us what is right and wrong. Who is the good Palestinian? Who is the bad Palestinian? Who is the moderate? Yes. Who is the terrorist and the radical? We need to tell our story finally from the point of view of the occupied and the oppressed and the resisting Palestinian people. And we should no longer feel ashamed to champion and talk about our resistance. And when I say resistance, Isra, I'm not talking about guns and bullets and rockets. I'm talking about the very essence, the very idea, the very concept of resistance. We have the right to defend ourselves. Not just that. We have the right to also imagine a situation in which we are fighting an actual war of liberation, a war of dignity, and a war of freedom.
Right. You mentioned about Hamas and Fatah. I was reading news about an Israeli party's leader who said that, we take PA as a liability and Hamas as an asset. So why they think that Hamas is an asset, and whenever they can use that bogey to attack the Palestinian people?
Right, but here's the thing. I mean, the fact that Hamas has been demonized as if the issue is essentially about Hamas, right? As if the conflict and everything that Israel has done to the Palestinians was in self-defense because of Hamas. Hamas right. was established in 1987. The ones who actually fought prior to Hamas for decades, challenging Israeli racism, apartheid, military occupation, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so forth, were actually the socialists and the secularists of the Palestinian national movement. The Islamic component of the Palestinian movement did not start until fairly recently. Yes. And even when Hamas is gone, there will be another movement, another generation, another ideology. What Palestinians have in common in the last 70 years is that they have always fought the Israeli occupation. They have always challenged Israeli ethnic cleansing. But the Israel, of course, for its own propaganda and its own agenda, makes the issue to be essentially about Hamas. And this happened particularly during the American war in Iraq and Afghanistan, when the Americans came up with, kind of this grand narrative in which right. they saw themselves fighting a war on terror. And sadly, that war on terror ended up being a war on Islamic movements and essentially on Islamic discourses. So for right. Netanyahu and Israeli leaders, they found the perfect opportunity to go out, to kind of latch into that narrative and to present their own war on the Palestinians, to be part and parcel of that war on terror. Of course, there's absolutely no link whatsoever, and there is no truth to that propaganda whatsoever.
Right. Ramzi, one more thing which is very important, and I think the immorality or selective morality has been exposed at every single level. But one thing is very, very evident, and that is the media. The way the Israelis attacked that media building, and even the owner of that AP tower, which was destroyed, and he said that there was no evidence of Hamas in the building. And there was no hue and cry by any international public opinion organization, including world media. So what if it was done in some Muslim country? Do you see this morality or immorality or selective morality, whatever you call it?
Oh, absolutely. Israel destroyed 9 towers in its war on the Palestinians in Gaza. Zero evidence that any of these towers have been used for any purpose of fighting Israel. Not just that, even the Israeli themselves, there is an Israeli captain in the Israeli army who was interviewed. I think it was in Haaretz, but it's quite popular on you know, the quotes that he said about why they destroyed the towers. They said, because we had no other, because we were feeling frustrated and depressed by the lack of progress in the war, and then we needed to vent. So they destroyed these massive 9 towers, some of them 14, 15-story buildings, including numerous flats, businesses, clinics, and so forth and so on, in order for them to feel just a moment of respite, to feel psychologically that they are achieving something, seeing these buildings implode to their very roots. Imagine if this scenario was repeated, not 9 towers, but a single tower, that where there is a terrorist attack anywhere in the world that was blamed on Muslims. This is going to be at the core of anti-Muslim propaganda for a generation. Israel does it, gets away with it, no questions asked. And this is what our responsibility is about. We need to confront not only Israel, but we need to confront the world with its moral and legal responsibilities regarding these kind of hideous war crimes that are being committed, not just in open daylight, but they are actually filmed on camera, and the whole world is actually able to see them again, you know, over and over again. Something needs to be done about this.
And part of this media campaign is the term called anti-Semitism. And then we recently saw our foreign minister being harassed by the CNN anchor on a TV show when he mentioned about the deep pockets of Israeli people who are sponsoring the international media. And she said that this is an anti-Semitic remark. So what is anti-Semitism? If you are criticizing the atrocities of Israelis, is this anti-Semitic?
Of course, well, there are 2 kinds of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism that is a form of it's an actual form of racism, where people develop prejudice against a person because of his ethnicity and religion and race. And that is something to be condemned and in the strongest terms. But what Israel refers to as anti-Semitism has very little, if anything at all, to do with that legitimate form of concern over real racism. Israel utilizes the term in a very deceptive way, where any criticism of Israel, the pro-Israel lobby in Washington, D.C. and in other capitals, including Canada and in other countries, any kind of legitimate criticism of that kind of behavior is being viewed as a form of anti-Semitism. Not just that, criticism of Zionism, which is essentially, in fact, entirely a political ideology that was incepted in the late 19th century, has nothing to do with the Jewish people, has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. They also perceive any criticism of the Zionist ideology and the Zionist movement as a form of anti-Semitism. We need to challenge that for 2 reasons. Number one, many of our supporters in the Palestine movement are Jewish themselves. And they are not self-hating Jews. They are morally grounded Jewish intellectuals and activists and ordinary people who stand in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people, like any other people and any other nation anywhere around the world. Number 2, we need to liberate this conversation, this stifling conversation that we can't talk about Israel, despite the fact that Israel's hideous behavior that is being recognized by the international community, by the United Nations, by Human Rights Watch, by Israel's own human rights groups like Beit Salem. Beit Salem in January came up with this extensive report of hundreds of pages in which they concluded that Israel, from the river to the sea, is an apartheid state. This is an Israeli Jewish group that is based in Israel itself. Now, is that a form of anti-Semitism as well? So no, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about the money that comes from the lobby groups to support Israel's causes and pro-Israel individuals in the US Congress. The money is being utilized by the Americans to buy and purchase weapons so that Israel may so-called defend itself, i.e. kill Palestinians in Gaza and so forth. We need to talk about the money, and we need to stop the flow of fund that is going...
And especially the role of different organizations like AIPAC.
Of course. I mean, AIPAC's budget is open. It's something that you can actually access. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are not just ideas we are passing on social media. They said, we know that AIPAC, in fact, the term that they use for AIPAC, whenever AIPAC is mentioned, even in mainstream media, is the powerful, the pro-Israel lobby AIPAC. The powerful. Right. Powerful in what sense? Powerful in their ability to convince and to make a case for Israel, or powerful in their ability to use and allocate funds in order for them to garner support for Israel among American congressmen and women. That's the real power of AIPAC, and that's what we need to challenge.
So let me bring your attention to the role of the country where you're sitting right now. You know, Biden administration, we've seen that, you know, he called Netanyahu 4 times during 11 days. But, you know, they waited for everything to be achieved, you know, their military objectives, whatever they were. But we saw some pressure from within the changing Democratic Party, because we see a lot of youth coming in. And I think there is a lot of change in the Democratic Party. Do you agree with this? And if yes, do you see any, you know, solid change in the Democratic Party?
I do. I think there is a lot of hope in the Democratic Party. And I think we are at the cusp of a major historical transition. The question is, how do we get there? How do we speed up this transition? Just a side note, it took Biden 9 days not to ask Israel to stop using American weapons to kill Palestinians, but 9 days to ask Israel and the Palestinians, as if they are equal partners in this, to de-escalate. So Biden has really failed the test, terribly failed the test. And he had a historic opportunity to change the Trump narrative regarding Israel. He had the opportunity to listen to the rank and file within the Democratic Party. Speaking about the rank and file of the Democratic Party, for the first time in history, the Democratic Party as a whole can be seen to be anti-Israel. The support that the Democrats have lent Israel throughout the decades is no longer there. And we are seeing this. You know, we talk about Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Cortez, and others. We talk about them as if, and also Sanders and others. We talk about them as if they are the ones who are actually leading that change. To the contrary, I argued in a recent article that they are merely listening to their constituency. The actual power is in the grassroots constituency of the Democratic Party. According to a Pew research poll, found that majority of Democrats who have heard and know about the BDS, the boycott movement, the Palestinian boycott movement, the majority of them actually support BDS. You see, so this is a major change. Who could have ever expected that the Democratic Party have this kind of progressive, radical ideas regarding Israel? Now, the congressmen and women in Washington, D.C., they need to start listening to their constituency. And that's what I talked about when I said we are at the cusp of a historical transition, but it all depends on how we push this transition forward and how do we speed it up in such a way that it will actually make a real tangible difference as far as the American foreign policy in the Middle East is concerned.
Okay, one more thing, Brother Ramsey, because that is my analysis, but you can disagree with it. But what I feel is that this escalation, recent escalation by the Israelis, had something to do with the Iranian deal. What I felt was that because they were trying to persuade the Americans, they didn't listen to them. They sent even the Mossad chief there. Then when the US Secretary of Defense was in Israel, they tried to push him. Nothing worked. So I think they thought that this is the best way to get the US attention to attack the Palestinians, and then obviously they will rush our way, and we will talk about Iranian deal. Do you agree with this assessment?
Isra, I think you are absolutely right on this. In fact, there's been some coded language coming from the US State Department. For example, a statement that came out a couple of days ago in which they said the US did not make any concessions to any party in order for the ceasefire for the ceasefire to be declared. What does that mean? Of course, they have not made any concessions to Hamas. The concessions would have been made to Israel, but in what context? In what file? Of course, it's the Iranian file. I think this is going to be an issue that we are going to be hearing about in coming days and weeks. This is the kind of things where you're going to start seeing leaks happening in various American mainstream newspapers, the New York Times and the like, about what has actually happened behind closed doors as far as Iran and the US is concerned. Perhaps the US did not want to push Israel too hard because they did not want to concede as far as the need to reactivate the Iran nuclear deal. But I really think that Iran must have been an item on the agenda of the American and Israeli foreign policy makers as they were discussing the possibility of a ceasefire.
Right. So when we are talking about Israel and the US and everything, I think we should do some introspection also. And when I talk about introspection, it means that, especially regarding the Oslo process, 25 years of Oslo, what have the Palestinians achieved out of it? Do you think is Oslo dead? If yes, two-state solution is also dead?
Yes, Oslo is dead, but it's dead as a political doctrine. The usefulness of that political doctrine was supposed to actually expire in 1999. That was a long time ago. It was supposed to expire in the sense that by 1999, there should have been a final status negotiations or so-called final status negotiations and a final agreement. That never happened, and the new status quo created by Oslo remained in place. But there is another Oslo that's not dead, which is the illusion that there was a peace process and there's a potential to reactivate this peace process. And we can actually go back and talk with the Americans being the so-called peace brokers, the honest peace brokers. This is what that illusion is still there. Sadly, many of those who have called earnestly for a ceasefire in recent days and weeks kept alluding to the fact that it is time to go back and rediscover that political horizon and reactivate Oslo and start negotiating once more. That's not what Palestinians want. Actually, Palestinians have lost much more land. 3 times the Jewish settlements, the illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank, for example, have tripled in size since Oslo. The Jewish population, the illegal settlers in the West Bank, have also tripled since Oslo. So what did Palestinians gain as a result of Oslo? Nil, nothing. If it's anything, it cemented their political disunity and fragmentation and factionalism. What Palestinians need, they need a vision, not for a peace process, but for liberation. A vision for liberation that brings them together with a whole new agenda in order for them to end the Israeli military occupation once and for all.
Right, absolutely. Brother Ramzi, you grew up in a refugee camp. You know that the travails of the Palestinian people, you've been through it. There are a lot of people who are in Israeli prisons. I remember there's a lady called Isra, who was sentenced to 11 years in Israeli prison and who is burnt. 65% of her body is burnt. So is there any hope for people like her, and especially people who are, languishing in the Israeli jails?
Right. Isra Jahabi is one of the most tragic stories among the 5,000 Palestinian prisoners who are currently languishing in Israeli prisons, including many women and many children as well, and over 500 of them held not even facing Israel's military court, because Palestinians do not see their day in a civil court, but rather in a military court. So it's an extremely tragic situation. I've wrote a book about it called These Chains Will Be Broken, which is my latest book, which is the stories of these prisoners told by the prisoners themselves. Some of these testimonies have been smuggled out through their lawyers, through the Red Cross and others. But the story of these prisoners cannot be delinked from the story of the Palestinian people themselves. When we say that Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison, we really mean it. It's a prison. People cannot go in and out. There are military all over the place. Drones are on top of them, watching their every move. Cancer patients cannot leave Gaza. Students cannot go to their universities. I cannot go back to Gaza. It's been years since I visited Gaza because Gaza is shut down and I cannot go back to see my own family, or let alone visit my parents' graves. So if Gaza is a prison, the West Bank is divided into these various South African-like Bantustan's type of prisons. People cannot leave and they cannot come back and so forth. And in order for them to leave and come back, they need permits from the Israeli military, and it's not easy to acquire these permits. So the 5,000 Palestinian prisoners who are in Israeli prisons right now are but a microcosm of the larger Palestinian imprisonment that has reached millions of Palestinians in throughout the occupied territories. So it has to be understood within this context. And I argue that in order for Palestinians to leave Israeli prisons, the Palestinian people themselves have to be entirely free from this sinister occupation that has been around for over 5 decades.
Absolutely. And finally, if you can comment on the role of different Muslim countries, especially Pakistan, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, in this latest conflict, whatever happened.
You know, recently, prior to all of this happening, there was been some pressure on Pakistan, among other Muslim and Arab countries, to join this
normalization process.
Yes, to join the normalization campaign that was pushed by the Trump administration. And by normalization, and the term itself doesn't sound too sinister and terrible, but in actuality, it is terrible. It is basically normalizing military occupation and apartheid and racism as if they are part of everyday reality, and there is nothing we can do about them. And then we open, diplomatic ties with Israel as if, the Palestinian people and their freedom do not matter in any way. Pakistan has been under intense American pressure, and there are geopolitical reasons of why Pakistan in particular. And we went out, reaching out to our sisters and brothers and comrades in Pakistan, saying, please, we can't afford losing Pakistan. We can't afford losing the solidarity of the Pakistani people. This situation that happened in Gaza really accentuated and affirmed these calls. And I am happy to report that normalization is no longer a debate in Pakistan, and not many people can openly go out there and speak about it on television or the media, that normalizing Israeli occupation serves the strategic interests of Pakistan in any way. The Palestinian people have to pay a very heavy price for us to get to this point, but at least I am pleased to see that Pakistan is back on the right track as not one of many Arab and Muslim countries who have supported Palestine and the Palestinians, but rather as one of the leaders of the pro-Palestine solidarity within the Muslim Ummah.
And are you satisfied with the stance the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, has taken?
I think we are definitely seeing that the political stance that have been communicated in recent years to be heading in the right direction. But what we would be quite happy about if we hear an actual stated confirmation that there is no debate and Pakistan, under no circumstances, will be normalizing with Israel until the Palestinian people are free and the Israeli occupation is completely over. And then the question then goes back to the Pakistani people. Pakistan is a democracy, and the Pakistani people ultimately would have to make that decision.
Well, one thing I can assure you, Brother Ramzi, that the Abraham Accord, so far as the Pakistanis are concerned, is already dead, right? And the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, has already told the nation that we will not recognize Israel until and unless we go back to 1967 spot, right? So it is very clear for the Pakistanis, and inshallah, things will be under control. And the Prime Minister has a lot of, commitment with not just the Pakistanis, but with the founder of Pakistan, who said these words, that we will not recognize Israel until and unless, the Palestinians have the rights. And he said that we can go to any length. And talking about this whole issue in the New York Times interview. So he said we can go to any length for Palestinians. So rest assured.
Absolutely. This is very reassuring indeed, Israr. And this is really the least we expect from our people in Pakistan. Quite often I get, when people ask me, where are you from? And I say Palestine, and they say Pakistan. I say Palestine, they say Pakistan. And it no longer frustrates me, because actually we are the same people. Palestine and Pakistan are the same people, and we need to keep it that way.
Absolutely, inshallah. And wish you every luck, Brother Ramzi. Wish Palestinians every luck, and hope to see you very soon, inshallah. And by then, we will keep working for the betterment of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much for your time.
Inshallah. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Israr Khan sahab shuru kare? Ji. I said roll tape, and I recorded an interview with Imran Khan, future Prime Minister of Pakistan.
پاکستان کے مشہور فنکاروں، گلوکاروں، سیاسی اور سماجی شخصیات سے خصوصی ملاقات منیزہ ہاشمی کے ساتھ پروگرام جو تم چاہو تو سنو میں ہر جمعے کی شام 7 بجے اونلی آن ہمارا ٹی وی۔
پنجاب آٹوز، ہر قسم کی گاڑیوں کی مرمت کا مرکز۔